Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 18. O Most Wondrous of Nights. Grevin sighed as he ran his fingers through his hair, his mind trying to figure out just how things had reached this point. He found himself deep in the apple orchard of Sweet Apple Acres, not terribly far from the edge of the everfree forest, the distant lights of Ponyville still visible in the night's darkness. He quietly sat down on the damp, soft earth, letting his eyes close for a few moments as he took a calming breath, as his mind ran over the events of the last few days, trying to take it all in. The day had begun like any other typical day. He rose just before sunrise and made his way into the orchard so he could go through his daily training. Afterward, he did some chores on the farm and then helped the apples get prepared for the Nightmare Night celebration. He helped Big Macintosh hitch up the wagon for a hayrack ride, and he even helped little Applebloom with her costume, a dragon of all things. When he asked her why she chose that costume, she simply smiled sweetly and said that since he was going as a knight, he needed a dragon to fight, and proceeded to latch onto his leg with a cute growl that made him almost die from the adorableness. He never saw Applejack, though. He had assumed that she would be there to help get things ready, but later he found out she had left with her costume and several barrels of the famous Apple family cider, shortly after he had gone into the forest to train. He had shrugged it off and gone about his day, thinking nothing of it, and prepared his own costume for the soon approaching festivities. His costume was fairly simple. His standard chest armor, gauntlets, gloves, boots, and thigh plates all polished and clean. He, against his better judgment, left his cloak, daggers, except for one out of habit, and swords back in the barn loft, thinking that it would be doubtful he would need them at all for that night. He was still worried about discord, but he knew that if something were to happen, he would be able to make do with what he had until help could arrive. When he had stepped out of the barn and into the light wearing his costume, the reaction from Applebloom had stunned him. Her eyes grew wide as the pupils focused on him, towering above her, the light shining from it making her rub her eyes for a few moments before returning to stare at him. His armor, now free from the darkness of his cloak, glistened in the sunlight, shining as though it had some sort of magical aura about it. The ornate detail in the design of it forced the little filly's eyes to dart back and forth, taking it all in until she focused on the crest in the center of the chest plate, the shield that had angel wings flaring out from it, etched in what could be described as gold and tiny fragments of gemstone, embedded smoothly into the shield itself.
Holy smokes, Grevin! I didn't know your armor looked like that under your cloak. Are you a real knight back in Bastion?
He blinked a moment and smiled, giving a small shake of his head.
Well, back in Bastion, I was simply a member of a guild. I was never considered to be knight material, but here in Equestria, the princesses thought I deserved that honor. My armor is something that I managed to find while exploring an old ruin of my people with my mentor. I was willing to leave this armor where it was found, but my mentor said I would be honoring the memory of my ancestors if I were to use it instead. To be honest, it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's gotten me through some very tough situations in my travels.
A lively filly grinned and trotted around him a few times, taking in more of the details of the armor.
Well, I think it makes you look very noble.
Yup. Their attention was drawn to Big Macintosh as he trotted up with the wagon behind him. He wore his grim pony costume from the year before, a simple smile on his face as he came to a stop.
I'm guessing it's time to head into town, isn't it, Big Mac?
Yup. Grevin nodded and scooped up Apple Bloom, who had grabbed her small cloth bag for collecting sweet treats, and helped her into the back of the wagon before he began to walk beside them.
All right then, let's go.
As they made their way into town, he couldn't help but notice that there seemed to be an odd, but not evil feeling beginning to wash over the area, almost like a sense of anticipation. The sun set with fewer colors than usual, and there was a small chill in the air that was accentuated by the small, scattered dark clouds that seemed to make the appearing stars and moon in the sky seem brighter by the second, rather than making them dim and hard to see. As the light of the day began to fade, the sound of laughter and joy began to make its way to his ears. The first part of the evening had begun. They made their way into town, and he took note of the various creative costumes that all the ponies had created for the event. Some were dressed as insects, one as a ninja, another as a chef. There was even one with a spiky haircut and tie. He found himself smirking when he saw some young foals dressed up as Paris sprites running up to the door of a nearby home and yell when they knocked, "Nightmare night, quite a fright, give me something sweet to bite." It was cute, he had to admit, the perfect activity for young ones to enjoy with their friends and family. As they made their way to the center of town, Grevin noticed that there were several tables of games and snacks set out for everyone to enjoy. He heard Applebloom jump off the wagon as Big Mac continued on his way, so he turned and watched as he ran up to several school-age foals that clearly were classmates. He had to admit their costumes were so good, he couldn't even tell which one was Sweetie Belle or Scootaloo. He slowly made his way over and noticed that not only was there several school-age foals there, but Pinkie Pie as well. It appeared that she had volunteered to lead this group door to door this year, which didn't surprise him that much. It was most likely because she would receive candy as well. But what did surprise him was her choice of costume. Her mane was hung as straight as could be from her head and tail, almost as though there were never any curls in it at any point in time. Her normally bright eyes still held a small glint of mischief, but also appeared to be quite serious, if not grim. In her mouth was a rubber knife, and she carried a cereal box that had several cuts in its front.
"Hiya, Grevy."
He blinked a moment before looking her in the eyes, noting that she had moved almost uncomfortably close once again.
Hello, Pinkie. I have to ask, what are you dressed up as this year?
She giggled and glanced at the cereal box she carried.
"You can't tell. I'm a serial killer."
She snorted and burst out laughing, as did the rest of the group. Grevin couldn't help but groan and roll his eyes at the terrible pun she had just made. He smirked as she gave her famous smile and glanced around for a moment.
Hey, Pinkie, do you know where the others are? I haven't seen them at all yet.
She raised a hoof to her chin and thought about it for a moment, her eyes glancing to the left, then to the right.
"Well, I know Twilight and Applejack are still putting the finishing touches on their costumes, but I saw Spike earlier going door to door with another group, and Rarity's helping out with some of the games."
Oh, I see. Well, I'm kind of new to this whole thing. Do you have any recommendations for what I should do first?
She grinned and nodded, motioning to the group she was with.
"Yeah, you should go with us. It'll be a blast. We're going door to door gathering candy, and then we'll go give part of our bounty to Nightmare Moon to keep her from gobbling us up. After that, we'll play some games and eat some awesome food."
She leaned in as her voice took on a darker tone, her eyes flashing menacingly, pulling her into character with how she was dressed.
"So will you join us, Grevy? Or will I have to make an example out of this box of Tastios?"
He paused for a moment, her tone setting him off balance. She was a little too good with that voice for his liking. She giggled and sat back, her grin forming back on her face.
"Well, are you going to join us or what, silly?"
He smiled a bit and nodded.
Alright, I think I'll join you. It sounds like a lot of fun.
She jumped up and bounced around the group a few times, a bright smile on her face, the foals watching her with bright smiles and wide eyes.
Great, let's go, every pony. We have lots of candy to get to, and we're burning moonlight. Come on.
With that, she began to bounce away, leading a small trail of foals and a tall man through the streets of Ponyville. For a short while, Grevin made his way through town, simply enjoying the laughter of the children and Pinkie Pie as they went door to door, seeking their sugary sustenance. He had to admit, it was pleasant to be able to walk in the open and not be looked at with disdain or hatred by the citizens, though he still felt oddly out of place without his cloak. There were even a few ponies who waved and said hello to him, their friendly voice making him feel quite welcome in the community. As he quietly followed behind the hyperactive pony known as Pinkie Pie, he couldn't help but wonder what would it have been like to grow up in Ponyville, surrounded by such warmth and kindness, instead of the city streets he was forced to become so familiar with. His thoughts were pushed away by the sudden ringing of a bell, causing the group to pause and look to the larger stage in the center of town. There stood Mayor Mare, dressed in something that appeared to be a fisherman's outfit, decked out with a flannel shirt, rubber boots, a vest covered with fishing lure, and a floppy cap atop her head. "Attention, every pony! If you would bring yourselves closer, Miss Sakura will begin tonight's tale of Nightmare Moon." Grevin blinked as many ponies, including his group, began to make their way to the stage, which had begun to spew green smoke out from its curtains. He was curious to hear this historic tale about Equestria's past, especially since he had now knew that it involved a past incarnation of Princess Luna. Though he had to admit, the mayor needed to try and have a scarier costume if she was going to laugh like that. He placed himself toward the back of the now bustling crowd of colts and fillies, and waited as the black curtains to the stage slowly opened, spewing forth even more green mist that seemed to now cover all of the surrounding earth. Slowly, from the shadows, a lone figure walked out into the moonlight, a pony with long white hair draped over her head, with spiders adorning it. Her coat was striped in a unique pattern of black and white, unlike anything he had seen before. She had golden earrings and even several gold bracelets around her neck and one of her legs. She wore a tattered old-looking witch's gown that was black as the clouds in the sky, her blue eyes showing mischief and a hint of mysticism in them. Slowly, she made her way to the edge of the stage, a small smile coming to her lips. "Find your seats, and very soon you'll hear the tale of Nightmare Moon. Listen close, my little dears, and I tell you what to fear on this nightmare night so dark and scary, for it is Nightmare Moon, you should be wary." She reached into a small satchel that was tied to her belt and pulled out a small bit of fine powder. She threw it over her shoulder, and behind her it seemed to explode into a massive cloud that soon began to shift and change into the shape of a fearsome-looking alicorn wearing armor, its eyes staring out at the now shivering crowd with narrowed, hungry eyes. "Every year we put on a disguise to keep us safe from her ever-searching eyes. For every nightmare night she visits all the towns, looking for little ponies." She smirked wickedly as she locked her eyes with Grevin's across the audience, a sinister tone entering her voice. "And nights to gobble down." Grevin crossed his arms, his stance shifting from one leg to the next, a simple smirk coming to his lips as she continued. "Hungrily she soars the sky, and if she sees no ponies, she passes by, keeping you safe until next time." Grevin chuckled now as he watched the small foals begin to back up until they reached him, and much to his surprise, some of them even moved themselves so they could hide behind his legs. He leaned down to one Apple Bloom, he believed, and patted her on the head.
It's all right. You're safe.
A soft but dark chuckle drew his attention back up to the stage, where Zecora stood watching with a hint of amusement in her eyes.
Ah, I see we have with us a special knight. Tell me, good sir, does Nightmare Noon not give you a fright?
Grevin smirked and shook his head as he slowly rose to his feet and did his best to appear to be a confident knight, full of bluster and arrogance, sadly similar to the few back in Bastion that he had been forced to humiliate.
Scared? Me? Of fable? Of a myth? Of course not. I think it may be a tale used to give us reason to have a big evening party. Besides, if we dress up in these costumes to protect ourselves, why collect all this candy?
He smiled a bit, causing Zecora to grin. He had just willingly provided her with more ammo to continue her story. Zecora turned and motioned to the magical construct behind her that seemed to move and slowly gaze out over the small village.
A very good question, my friend. You see Nightmare Moon, you mustn't offend. Offer her a treat or two, that she may not come to eat you.
Grevin grinned and nodded as he kept his arms across his chest, continuing his little bit with the mystical pony. He never noticed the small shadow beginning to appear beside him, nor the foals moving away from behind him.
Well, all right, I suppose that makes sense. But what if I'm not scared of her on this night?
This caused several of the young foals to gasp and face him, fear in their eyes. Zecora simply smirked as she raised her hoof and pointed at him.
Well, my dear knight, turn around and be ready to test your might.
He paused, now caught off guard by what she had said. He was expecting more playful banter, instead of something so cryptic.
What? Turn around? I don't follow.
She simply chuckled and nodded, motioning with her hoof for him to do a complete turnaround. He heard a few of the foals take a slow breath as he began to turn his head, and slowly, over his shoulder, he saw what appeared to be a pony wearing a large black cloak, standing directly behind him, their face hidden, their body unmoving as a cold breeze slowly caused the cloth to flow around its feet. Grevin took a small step backward as he completed his turn, a small hint of concern beginning to poke at him from the back of his mind. He didn't know who this pony was, nor how they managed to get behind him so easily. His attention was pulled to the pony once more, as a sudden bolt of lightning flashed behind it, revealing a set of white, unholy-looking eyes, and a dark face for a split second as thunder rumbled its way across the crowd. He watched as the figure leaned forward ever so slightly and took a slow breath before speaking with a slow, regal-sounding female voice.
So you do not fear Nightmare Moon, Sir Knight?
He slowly shook his head as he felt a cold chill begin to work its way up his back. He had rarely felt this kind of feeling before, and to be honest with himself, it made him uncomfortable, especially when a dark laugh began to echo from the mayor's lips. He knew, though, that he couldn't show any sign of fear or weakness when facing something unknown.
No, I can't say that I do.
This made the mayor pause, before laughing darkly once again. But before he could speak once more, she reared back, hitting him on the chest with her hooves, knocking him to the ground. He frowned and watched as a pair of black wings splayed out from her sides, causing the cloak to fall away, and a gasp of fear to rise from the citizens gathered at the stage. Standing before them was an alicorn feared by many. Her cloak was black as night, her eyes piercing white, making it look as though she could look into a pony's very soul. Her horn was long and sharp, and her armor and helmet gleamed in the moonlight, making her look even more intimidating. But what struck out to Grevin the most was the set of razor-sharp teeth, looking as though they were bared. It was Nightmare Moon herself. Griffin tried to rise to his feet, only to have her lunge forward once more, forcing her hooves onto his chest and abdomen, knocking him easily onto his back and holding him down, earning a small shriek from the crowd as they tried to back away from the intimidating princess of the eternal night. Griffin frowned, feeling the pressure of her hooves on his chest, while he looked up at the powerful mare above him. She smirked and stared down at him, and after a few seconds, she gave a quick wink, throwing him off guard. The mare raised her head and once again faced the crowd. What came next could only be described as ear-shattering. "Citizens of Ponyville!" His ears rang as the force of her voice caused him to physically shake and fall back once again to the dirt. "As you know, I, Nightmare Moon, consider this night to be a night of honor and joy. However, it's clear to us this year's celebration is lacking. Perhaps with proper tribute, your celebration can be saved. I will be waiting for it with my new prize. Perhaps he can be saved before I gobble him up, and the Nightmare Night celebration will be able to continue for another year." Griffin cringed, feeling his eardrums shake with each word she spoke. But before he could bring his hands to his ears, he found himself being enveloped in a thick cloud of smoke, causing his vision to blur, blocking out everything except the smirking mare who remained above him. He felt an odd sensation of falling, causing him to twist and squirm, until a few moments later, when the smoke began to fade, and he realized that they were no longer in the center of Ponyville. He felt the mare move away from him, allowing him time to gather his senses and sit up. Once his vision cleared fully, he learned that she had taken him to a small clearing outside of Ponyville. There was nothing there except for a small dirt path and a large statue of Nightmare Moon that clearly looked to be quite old. As he glanced around, he found that his captor had moved behind him and was simply watching him with a small smirk on her lips, her razor-sharp teeth glinting ever so slightly in the moonlight, her blue cat-like eyes watching him with a hint of humor in them as he slowly rose to his feet. "Well, I certainly think that will make it a night to remember for them, don't you?" He blinked a moment in confusion as he carefully watched the now smiling mare. She didn't seem as intimidating as Twilight and the others had described, and then it hit him. His mind finally caught up with what was happening.
"Princess, you had me fooled for a few moments there."
Nightmare Moon laughed softly before a magical aura enveloped her form, causing it to shift and shrink a bit, causing her to take on a more delicate shape. Moments later, Princess Luna stood before him, holding a small set of fake teeth in her hoof, her bright blue eyes smiling at him. "Was I too in character for you, Sir Hades? Did you truly think that Nightmare Moon had come to Ponyville for her tribute?" He raised his hand to the back of his head, scratching the nape of his neck slightly as he smiled.
"Well, to be honest, I wasn't quite certain what to expect. After all, with Discord running around, anything could happen. But I believe I know what's going on now."
She smiled and moved around to his right side, letting her wing and tail ever so slightly brush over his arm, causing small goosebumps to rise on his flesh, making him shift on his feet slightly. "Oh, and what would that be?" Her voice was light and cheerful. He turned, doing his best to ignore the soft sensation that ran up his arm, and watched her as she made her way over to the statue, standing before it, looking at it with a distant gaze.
"You're playing with the foals and the other ponies, giving them a small but fun scare for the night. It's kind of you to get into the festivities with them."
She smiled and tilted her head down, her eyes closing as a small sigh escaped her. "It wasn't always that way, you know. When I first came to Ponyville, just after being freed from Nightmare Moon's grasp, I was looked upon with what I felt was true fear from the village. I didn't understand when they screamed and ran that it was out of a fearful fun rather than terror. It took the wisdom of Twilight Sparkle and the laughter of Pinkie Pie and the patience of Applejack to help me truly understand what was happening. I almost canceled Nightmare Night forever until they helped me see the truth. He blinked a moment and slowly moved forward, so he was standing beside her. He hesitated a moment, uncertain how his next action would go over, but he didn't feel right hearing the somber tone in her voice and doing nothing to help. Slowly, he reached over and lightly ran his hand across the back of her neck and gently slid it down to her back, stopping just before he reached between her wings.
And what was that truth, Princess?
She took in a quick breath, her eyes snapping open and locking onto him, causing his hand to freeze just at the edge of her wing muscles. Her cheeks flushed red and her wings ruffled slightly, but a small smile came to her lips as she turned her head to look at him with both eyes, saying nothing as she just stared at him. Grevin blinked a moment, noting how her eyes seemed almost glossy as she looked at him, her lips curling into a soft smile. The slight hue of red on her cheeks was cute, almost too cute. It seemed that these ponies, the rulers included, had ways of looking adorable in almost any situation. The silence, though, was deafening, and he couldn't help but think he had made some sort of mistake when he touched her back.
Princess, I'm sorry,
He began to pull his hand back, only to see her horn light up with a soft glow, his hand becoming encased in a similar aura, which then proceeded to halt his retreat. He almost expected to find himself being thrown across the clearing. After all, many royalty in Bastion considered the touch of a commoner to be degrading, and if that person were of a unique nature, it would be downright disgusting. However, instead of being thrown airborne, he found his hand being returned to its original position on her back. He glanced at his hand, then back at Luna, confusion once again washing over his features.
Princess?
Luna's blush grew, but so did her smile. Mr. Hades, Grevin, what did we tell you about how to address us when we were alone? He sheepishly smiled and raised his free hand in apology.
I'm sorry, Luna. Old habits do die hard.
She winked and shook her head, her ethereal mane shifting with emotion, making her look quite elegant. It's all right. You did nothing wrong. To answer your question, I learned that the children enjoyed my company and were playing a game with me without my knowledge. Once I learned the truth, everything fell into place, and I've done my best to return to Ponyville every Nightmare Night to play our little game. I even do my best to make the sky look its finest for the event. This made him smile. Genuinely smile. He had heard of some royal charity in Bastion for a few peasants and a few kingdoms, but nothing like this. Never had he seen royalty not only come and visit on a holiday, but to play with the children, to help make the event special. That was amazing.
That is one of the greatest things I've ever heard. No royalty in Bastion would ever do something so kind, so fun for children. You have a good and kind heart, Luna.
Her eyes brightened and her smile became sheepish as she lightly ducked her head to the side, her gaze a bit reminding him of a shy young woman who had been embarrassed. But even with her current distraction, she kept her magic hold on him, keeping his hand in place on her back. In fact, it almost felt like it was being moved more towards the center of her back. You really think that? He gave a slow nod, his smile still showing, a small chuckle escaping his throat as he took in how sheepish the once bold princess had become.
I do. I think you even did an amazing job with the sky tonight. The moon is bright enough for every pony to see clearly, while still giving it a dark,
ominous feeling, perfect for the holiday. Luna's cheeks were quite red by now, her head tilted further away from his gaze. Now while her eyes seemed to glaze over, her thoughts clearly taking the forefront of her attention. Grevin paused a few moments before glancing down to his hand that was still held to her magical aura, and after a few more seconds he began to frown and tug at it, hoping to free himself.
Luna?
Luna? The Princess of the Night didn't move, almost as if she didn't hear him, her thoughts drawing the majority of her attention. Perfect, she mumbled, lost in her own little world, causing him to frown a bit. He leaned in close and closed his eyes, knowing what would happen next wouldn't end well, but he needed to free his hand. He took a deep breath and placed his mouth right next to her ear.
Luna!
What happened next would be a chaotic blur forever etched in his memory. As soon as the sound shocked her back to reality, the princess became so startled that her wings shot open with a loud pomp, slamming into his chest, knocking him off balance. An instant later, her horn flared with a strong magic aura, causing his hand and wrist to shift and fly off her back and into the air, dragging him with it against his will. He managed to utter out a partial phrase,
"Oh shit!"
before being slammed to the side of the statue's base, hitting it just right so it knocked the wind from him. This gave her enough time to focus her thoughts and encase his arms and feet in a strong magical field, preventing him from moving while she glared at him, a hoof raised up, nursing her flattened ear. "Why did you do that?" He sighed and tugged at his arms once more.
"I was trying to pull you back to reality. You had my hand stuck in your magic and I was beginning to get uncomfortable. I'm sorry if I hurt your ear."
She rolled her eyes and moved closer, a small chuckle escaping her. "Grevin, I was simply lost in my own thoughts. I'm sorry about keeping you stuck like that." He shrugged, his shoulders as best he could.
"It's fine, really. But, well, could you let me down now?"
Much to his chagrin, she simply smirked and shook her head, as she moved closer and watched him with half-lidded eyes. "I'm sorry, but no." He frowned, his frustration and confusion slightly showing in his voice.
"Why not?"
She smirked and turned, letting her tail smack him in the face, its soft, ethereal form teasing his skin as she walked away from him. "Because, one, you need to look like a knight being held captive when the children come, which should be set any moment now. And two..." He shook his head, trying to lose the tickling sensation she had left across his cheeks with her tail, and watched her as she moved away. Was she moving her hips a little more than before?
"And two..."
She turned and winked with a mischievous grin, her blue eyes flashing with mirth. "You need to pay tribute to me. It's my holiday after all." He blinked a few brief moments with wide eyes. His jaw slackened a bit.
"Wait, what?"
Elsewhere, in the depths of the everfree forest, a shadowy figure made her way through the dense brush, trying to make her way towards a boisterous sound in the distance. She had been traveling through the mysterious forest for several weeks, doing all she could to survive while making her way back to civilization. Slowly, she pushed her way out of the brush and into the moonlight, finally escaping the darkness of the forest, and allowed the dim light to reveal her black coat and fierce green eyes. In the distance, Chrysalis, the former queen of the changelings, could see the village of Ponyville, clearly having some sort of celebration, the sounds of foals laughing reaching her ears, bringing a small smirk to her lips, her fangs glinting in the silver light. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief that she had managed to find her way to some form of civilization after her defeat at Canterlot. She had been so confident of her victory in Canterlot that she failed to realize just how strong the bond between Princess Celeste Cadence and Shining Armor had been, and she had paid a price for her arrogance. The blast from the shield they produced was enough to throw her far from the capital, and once she had fully recovered from her wounds, she tried to muster her remaining forces to return to their homeland. However, upon reaching the borders of their homeland, they found themselves barred from entrance. She could feel her blood boil, with fangs bared, growling at the memory of how her former subjects barred their way past the border, informing her that due to their failure, they too were to be punished. She was stripped of her position by a rebellious brood mother, Crimson Wing, a brash mare who saw an opportunity and took it, banishing Chrysalis and a small force of changelings that remained from her invasion army. She had no choice but to try and make her way across Equestria, finding nourishment when they could. Yes, they primarily fed on the emotions given off by ponies, but they could scrape by on fruit, bread, and vegetables. But it was difficult. By the time they reached the Everfree, only a small handful of changelings remained under her control. While she ultimately didn't care about the changelings following her, every time one of her remaining brood died, she would feel more and more isolated, which was not a feeling she cared for. Her suffering wasn't in vain, however, and by a stroke of good luck, she received word from some of the hive still loyal to her back in her homeland. There was a new creature that had made an appearance in Equestria, a creature of great strength and honor, and most of all, deeply hidden emotions. And that is what brought her here now. Perhaps she could find this creature, befriend it, and use it to give her the strength she needed to take her back her hive, and kill that overzealous bitch that threw her out. A sharp scream caused her piercing green eyes to widen, and drew her attention back to the small village, forcing her to put her current thoughts to the back of her mind. Something had caused a large disruption to the celebration, and then she saw it. Rising out of the center of town was a large pillar of black smoke that spun quickly in a tight spiral. She watched as it rose into the air and twisted about for a few moments before arching around to land back down in what appeared to be a clearing hidden just outside of town. A small smirk came to her lips as her eyes began to glow a fierce bright green, and a burst of green flame surrounded her for a few moments before disappearing, and in her place now stood an average-sized unicorn pony who had a light teal coat, a two-tone mane of emerald green with several silver streaks in it, blazing bright green eyes, and on her flank was a simple emerald that seemed to be sparkling. With her disguise completed, Chrysalis narrowed her eyes in determination and began to run toward the clearing, hoping she could at least get some sort of glimpse as to what had caused all the noise in Ponyville. Perspective change. Griffin sighed and shook his head as Luna looked at him expectantly from where she sat in front of him, a look of mirth in her eyes.
Luna, I don't have any candy to give to you. I'm sorry, but I can't give you the tribute with something I don't have.
Luna raised a hoof to her mouth, her smirk growing into a full grin, the humor of the situation making her laugh.
Well, I suppose I can't let you go then, can I?
Her ears twitched at the sound of snapping twigs and laughing children coming from the nearby dirt path, her grin growing as she levitated her fangs back to her mouth.
Oh good, they've come to save you.
Her horn flared once again, her form shifted and returned to the imposing figure of Nightmare Moon, though this time her eyes still had a hint of mirth in them. She made her way past Grevin, leaving him prone against the side of the statue base, and hid herself behind it, blending in flawlessly with the shadows there. Grevin couldn't help but smile at the kick Luna got out of this little game, and had to admit that if he were in the same position to do such a thing, he would enjoy it too. He watched with interest as several foals ran into the clearing, led by the one and only Pinkie Pie, all of whom carrying bags filled to the brim with various candies and treats. Pinky grinned as her eyes locked onto his, and she slowed the group just before the statue.
All right, every pony, there's Grevin. Let's give up our candy so Nightmare Noon will let us have another Nightmare Night.
The group began to move forward, ready to distribute their goods, when an ominous laugh filled the night air, sending chills down their spines. From behind the dark statue, a dark figure slowly made her way out into the moonlight, her piercing, solid white eyes glaring at the bunch as she moved to stand before the statue. Grevin saw her take a deep breath and close his eyes, bracing for what he knew what was coming next.
Children of Ponyville, I see you bring tribute to me in an attempt to save this brave night and to keep your annual celebration. Know that your celebration will continue thanks to your diligence. However, I'm afraid your friend here needs a little more education on Nightmare Night.
She lowered her head and smiled devilishly at the now cowering bunch.
So return to your games and celebration, and he will join you in time.
She took a step forward, looking Sweetie Belle in the eyes.
Unless one of you would care to take his place.
Within 3 seconds, the only two souls remaining in the area were Grevin and Luna. A faint dust trail and the sound of distant laughing, the only sign there was once a group standing in the clearing with them. Luna laughed as her horn once again glowed, and her form shifted back to its original, the fake teeth once again being removed from her mouth. Grevin couldn't help but smile as well, seeing the scared yet excited look in the foal's eyes. Made it clear to him that they truly enjoyed their time with their princess. He paused at that thought, his mind taking him back to Bastion for a moment, forcing him to compare his former home to his new one. He let his gaze shift around a moment before focusing once again on Luna, specifically the smile upon her lips and in her deep blue eyes. She was something that never existed in Bastion, a royal who clearly loved her subjects and who in turn was loved by them. This land never ceased to surprise him, even when he had thought he had it all figured out. A small giggle pulled him from his thoughts, snapping his attention back to Luna, who now turned around slightly and was staring at him with those same amused eyes, a sly smirk on her lips. "You're staring." Slowly, she turned herself to face him fully, her ethereal mane flowing beautifully behind her, her wings flaring out slightly, adding to the sight. Her eyes gleamed with something besides simple mirth, and her smirk remained while her voice seemed to become a bit softer and more demure. "Do you see something you liked, Grevin?" He blinked a moment before he realized just what it looked like he was doing earlier. It would be quite easy to misconstrue his staring at her, and his cheeks turned a slight shade of red, barely visible in the moonlight.
No, I mean, yes, but not what you think.
Luna smiled softly as she lowered her eyes, trying to use her mane to hide her own cheeks, which were hinting at a slight shade of red. She moved forward slowly, to the still prone man, until she was but a few steps away, before sitting on her haunches, and slowly raising her gaze to meet his, taking a few moments to observe how he looked in his armor. "So then, tell me what you do mean." He smiled a bit and looked to the side as he tried to gather his thoughts into a proper sentence.
"Well, back in Bastion, royalty never did anything close to what you just did."
She tilted her head to the side, letting her gaze wander over to his face, finally settling on his eyes, her curiosity showing on her face. "I'm not sure what you mean when you say that." He turned his head away, avoiding her piercing eyes. Damn, the way her eyes pull him in and seem to always find a way to lock with his.
"Well, you just gave a tremendous thrill to those fools by participating in the celebration with them. Not only that, but it was quite clear you enjoyed doing it. In Bastion, royalty never have anything to do with common folk, and look down on anyone lower in class than them, while you and the others seem to embrace them as equals. You care. That is something special and quite heartwarming.
Luna was so surprised by this that her magical hold on him broke, dumping him down to the ground before her. His words echoed in her mind for a moment, before a bright smile began to form on her lips. I am glad you find it so, and I must say, at first, I didn't understand the children and their games. 1,000 years locked away will do that to a pony. However, thanks to Twilight and her friends, I was able to reach this point, and I would not trade it for anything. Griffin slowly rose back to his feet and began to dust himself off as he listened, his own eyes watching her, taking in the sincere look of her.
I'm glad to hear that, Luna. Children can never have too many good role models to look up to.
As the words left his lips, Luna's eyes seemed to snap open in surprise, a look of shock coming to her features. Her ears stood up straight, and her wings ruffled uncomfortably for a few seconds before slowly relaxing. She turned her head and looked away for a few moments, saying nothing, only watching the ground under her hooves, before snapping her head back up to stare at him with her deep blue eyes, making him squirm a bit under her gaze.
Role model? I'm a good role model? She asked quietly, her voice sounding softer than he had ever heard before.
Slowly, Grevin nodded, a small smile forming on his lips.
Of course you are. Is there any doubt? It's quite clear to me that these ponies adore you, Princess. We need to take the time out of your busy schedule to not only make the night more beautiful than it usually is for their celebration, but then, on top of that, you take part in their celebration, bringing a thrill to their evening. It shows you care and want to be a good ruler to them. Growing children, foals, have to look up to that. How could they not? If anyone is going to know, it's me. Back in Bastion, I grew up on the streets, alone. I would have been thrilled to catch a glimpse of a royal family member passing me on the street, let alone be able to have one participate in a celebration with me.
As he spoke, Luna took every word to heart, her right forehoof sliding up to her chest plate, just over her heart. She felt a warmth come from within that was brought on by the truth of his words, causing her eyes to water in joy. She slowly turned her head back to look at Grevin for a few seconds before speaking, her voice still soft and quiet. You mean that? Even after I became Knight Moon, and did so many terrible things that caused me to be exiled, you mean to say I'm still capable of being a good role model? After all that? He smiled and nodded once more, while crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes locking onto hers.
I mean every word. If one makes an effort to overcome their past ways in order to improve not only themselves, but to also improve the life of another, then it shows just how strong their character truly is. I'm pretty sure you fit the bill, and by showing that kind of character, you've clearly shown that you are a good role model.
He never could have expected what happened next. Luna began to cry as a large smile broke out across her face, and she quickly lunged forward, using her wings to give her a small burst of speed, tackling him before he could do anything besides throw his arms out to the side in an attempt to keep his balance. She threw her forelegs around him as a cry of pure joy escaped her lips, her muzzle finding its way to his collar, nuzzling against the crook of his neck while they both fell backwards into the dirt. Griffin grunted as the wind was knocked from him by the force of Luna throwing him to the ground, and for a moment he thought about trying to push her off of him, but then he felt a cool wetness against his neck, as well as what sounded like soft sobs echoing off his shoulder. Slowly, he wrapped an arm around the Princess of the Night, holding her in a gentle embrace while she cried cheers of joy into his collar. He let the fingers of both of his hands slowly rub up and down her neck, and through the fine, star-covered hair of her mane, the feel of it reminding him of the finest silks from his homeland, cool and soft. Slowly, He slid his right hand down her neck and to her back, stopping just before her wings, rubbing the tension from her as she trembled under his hands. He turned his head as her shaking began to slow and whispered gently into her ear.
Princess Luna, are you all right? Have I upset you? I did not mean to offend if I...
He was cut off by a soft hoof pressed against his lips, causing him to stop mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly, and found himself centimeters from the gentle eyes of the pony now resting atop him. Her cheeks were wet with tears, but her smile was bright, making him feel a bit more at ease.
Sir Hades. Grevin, I thank you. Ever since my return from exile, I've done my best to return to normal pony society. I've had to adjust to many new customs, new rules, new ideas, and through it all, I was still looked at with a great deal of fear and mistrust. My sister and my niece, as well as Twilight and her friends, did what they could to help me adjust. But through it all, I believe I lost sight of what I truly wanted. I wanted to be recognized, appreciated, looked up to. I never thought it would happen until you just showed me that it already has, and I simply hadn't realized it.
She slowly shifted her position, letting her forelegs slide to either side of his head, while shifting her lower portion to sit more comfortably on his waist and hips. Her eyes were half-lidded, and her voice became slightly huskier as she softly pressed herself down against his torso.
I believe that you have given me the tribute I asked for earlier.
Grevin, for his part, had been all right with the close proximity up to that point. As soon as she pressed her form against him, and he felt her soft breath against his lips, his cheeks lit up in record time. He quickly averted his gaze and swallowed the lump that had suddenly formed in his throat, as he moved his hands to her sides in an attempt to lift her off of him. Unfortunately, Luna misinterpreted his actions and smirked, flaring her wings out over them, while a small giggle rose from her throat.
Princess, I don't know if it would be best for us to be in this position. What if someone comes upon the scene?
Luna smirked and shook her head, her mane draping down around his head and shoulders in a kind of shroud.
I am not concerned. You won't be like this for long. I simply wish to thank you for your kind words.
This struck a chord in Grevin that sent a very cold chill down his spine. She wished to thank him. The last time a princess did that, he found himself in another compromising position that left him uncomfortable for days. The look on his face did not escape Luna's attention, and she chuckled softly as she slid a soft hoof and gently brushed it across his cheek, her touch drawing his eyes back to hers.
Is something the matter, Sir Hades?
He frowned a bit as her touch pulled him back to reality and the situation at hand, and he tilted his head away from her, earning a small frown from his captor, who was looking at him with eyes which no longer held a softness in them, but instead what looked like traces of hunger.
Princess, I believe we should be getting up now.
Luna shook her head once more, before sitting back slightly, letting her hips rest against his, pressing down ever so slightly, making him shift uncomfortably as he felt his manhood begin to respond to the sensation of her soft flank resting against him. She pressed her left hoof down against his chest, enjoying the smooth feeling of his armor against her hoof.
I don't think so. At least not yet. I wish to talk to you about what Cadence discussed with you during your stay in Canterlot.
He froze a moment, his breath catching in his throat. If she knew what Cadence spoke to him about, then she may also know exactly what Cadence did in order to have that conversation. Perhaps that is the reason she is resting atop him, the way she is.
Luna, Princess, I'm not certain I am comfortable speaking about that topic at this moment. Shouldn't we be getting back to the party?
Luna simply smiled and winked as she wiggled against him ever so slightly, causing him to blush as the sensation of her rubbing against his rising manhood rippled through his form.
Oh, please. I simply do wish to know if you've given it any more consideration to what she spoke to you about. Do you think you could open up your heart once more to the possibility that love could find you? Do you think you could love a pony?
While her smile was soft and gentle, her demeanor was calm, as could be despite their current position. Deep in her heart, she was quite nervous. Under her hose was one of the most unique beings in all of Equestria. He was a misunderstood soul who was kind, brave, and was gentle yet strong. He had caught her attention the moment she saw him in Canterlot, sensing a kindred spirit of sorts. And after seeing him privately, her interest in him grew. After hearing tales of his actions in battle in Canterlot, and his most recent kind words, she couldn't help but hope that perhaps he would be willing to let love back into his life, and perhaps he could see her as more than a co-ruler of Equestria. Grevin closed his eyes a moment and looked away, his mood darkening. He took a slow breath, trying to push down the sensations washing over him, and let out a quiet sigh as he tried to clear the haze from his mind. He forced himself to ignore Luna's movements, and once again opened his eyes and gazed out toward the path that led to Ponyville, knowing that he wasn't truly sure he could answer her. He knew quite clearly now that a few ponies had taken interest in him, some more than others, but he figured it would pass in time. However, the prospect of no longer being alone, to have a partner in life, well, it was extremely tempting. He slowly turned his head, letting his eyes lock once more with Luna's, taking note of their shimmering beauty, and the way they watched him with what could only be described as a small glint of hope in them.
Well, I have been thinking on it quite a bit, to be honest. Long ago I swore myself I would never let my heart open again, to avoid being hurt once more. However, the more time I spend here, the more good I see, the more attention I continue to somehow receive. I find myself beginning to question my past choice.
Luna's eyes softened as did her smile upon hearing his words, her movements against him slowing to a gradual halt.
Why is that, if I may ask, that is?
He took another slow breath and never broke his gaze from hers, his red eyes seeming to pierce into her soul.
In Bastion, I was looked at as a monster. Here, I've been treated so kindly. I've been treated as a friend from the very beginning. I've been given a place to lay my head, food to eat, work to do. I've never been questioned harshly, screamed at, or attacked. I've even found myself gaining the attention of a few mares without really meaning to. It goes against everything I knew. And perhaps the love will be the same way here. Who knows? Perhaps, instead of being hurt, I will find the greatest comfort at all. I am simply uncertain at this point in time. I find myself wondering if some of these infatuations are simply crushes that will pass on, or if they will only continue to grow, and if they do, will I be able to handle what comes next? On top of all that, the idea of being an object of affection is very new to me, and honestly, it's a bit intimidating.
Luna's heart began to beat a little faster as she listened to him, her smile only growing as she slowly began to lean her head down, slowly moving closer to him. His words touched her, and she knew that he was taking a step in the right direction.
That is one of the best things about opening one's heart, though. The uncertainty, the anticipation of the unknown. It can be quite a thrill.
She quickly leaned down and placed a soft, chaste kiss on his lips, before turning her head and whispering into his ear, her warm breath washing over his skin, making him shiver under her.
I think that perhaps you will learn more about the possibility of a relationship here, Grevin. I have a feeling that it can be quite a bit different here compared to your homeland. No doubt you'll have questions.
She smirked and lightly nipped at his ear, tugging at it ever so lightly.
I'd be happy to help and answer any questions you may have. In a private session, of course.
His breathing paused as he felt himself stiffen further against her as she teased him, his pulse quickening despite his efforts to control himself. He let out a slow, shaky breath and hesitantly nodded. Perhaps I should learn more in general, and I'll have questions for certain. However, I think I'll avoid private sessions for now. Luna frowned for a split second before hiding it behind a soft but sincere smile.
Thank you for answering my questions, Grevin. I do wish I could thank you further for your kind words, however.
Slowly she pulled back and rose to her hooves, backing away from him a few steps.
But I believe it's time to return to the party in Ponyville. Your friends are probably beginning to worry about you, and we shouldn't keep them waiting.
He slowly pulled himself up to his feet and took a few steps away from the princess before leaning down to dust himself off, being mindful to do his best to cover the tent in his pants, a small frown coming to his face. You know what? I begin to worry about having to watch my step around you princesses. I don't know why, but it appears that all of you seem to enjoy teasing the hell out of me. You're not making it any easier for me to... when you do that, you know. Luna let out a small laugh before she moved a few steps closer to the man.
Are you saying we have a habit of teasing you and leaving you high and dry? You think we are just trying to get a rise out of you for a few laughs?
He sighed and nodded as he rose back to his full height, while crossing his arms over his chest, fairly confident that he had finally managed to get his mind and member back under control. Yes. Luna simply smiled and winked as she walked past him, letting her tail rise up and brush over his chest, and lightly glance across his chin in a teasing gesture.
Then you should be ever so careful around Celestia. If you think Cadence or I will dad, you have no idea what to expect.
He blinked a moment before a frown came to his lips, and he quickly turned, moving after the princess as she made her way down the path towards Ponyville. Wait a second. What do you mean by that? Luna? Princess? Hold on a second. Nearby, Chrysalis slowly slowed her pace as she approached the location she had seen the cloud of smoke touch down in. As it turns out, her initial summary had been correct. It was an old clearing just outside the village. However, it was clearly not just some random location. At the very edge, it was an old statue of the fabled Nightmare Moon. But that sight was not what caught her attention. She barely felt it at first, but then it hit her fully. Emotions. Pure emotions. She felt them radiating off the two creatures in the clearing, making her almost begin salivating at the sensation. The emotion she felt was jumbled at first, almost as if it were confused. Then it suddenly shifted and changed. It became joyful and sweet to her senses, followed by an even stronger taste of love, though it wasn't very strong. Oh, how she missed the sensation of that washing over her, filling her with strength. She had to know who was giving off these powerful emotions. She did her best to keep her new form hunkered down into a crouched position as she moved closer to the field. Within a few moments she was able to get a very clear view into the clearing, and what she beheld there surprised her greatly. There was the one and only Princess Luna, lying atop a creature unlike anything she had seen before. She would compare it to a diamond dog, but it was larger, more muscular, wearing what appeared to be armor. No, this wasn't a diamond dog at all. It was clearly something larger, something more. From what she could tell, it was a male of some sort, and fairly large judging from the length of its body. She could tell that he wore some sort of armor, but any true detail about this creature was lost due to her view. She would have to wait to get a better look, but until then, she could still feel the emotions pouring off the two, and that was enough to keep her attention glued to them. She could see that they were talking quietly back and forth, their moving lips, and after a few moments, she saw Luna slowly begin to lean down, as a sense of nervousness seemed to pulse from the male beneath her. Chrysalis couldn't help but smirk, seeing how this strong warrior that she had heard so much about was intimidated by a simple pony princess. That was, however, until a new emotion slammed into her, making her dizzy with its sensation, forcing her to shut her eyes to keep from falling over. It was lust. Pure, burning, wanting lust. The odd mirror image of love, and Chrysalis could only shiver as she felt it wash over her, filling her with strength, a small shaky breath escaping her lips. Slowly, she reopened her eyes and looked over at the two, trying her best to identify which of the two gave off the brief, yet strong torrent of emotion. She managed to push past the remaining sensation that continued to wash over her form, digging through it to find that the nervous feeling she had identified before was still very present, causing her eyes to widen in surprise. She couldn't believe it. The Princess of the Night, Princess Luna, wanted him. This was a royal princess, sister to Princess Celestia, co-ruler of the land. She could have any pony she wanted, stallion or mare, and she wanted this enigma of a being. She could understand that there may be a small amount of stallions in the land, but as princess, Luna could simply take anyone she wanted. So why him? She paused in her thinking as she watched Luna lean down and give this being a soft kiss, confirming what she had sensed before, moving off of him, allowing him to get up. Chrysalis took the opportunity to get a better look at the creature, now that their view wasn't obstructed. He was indeed tall, and from what she could tell, strong. She confirmed her thoughts on him being a warrior, however, the moment she saw the way he carried himself, and the unique-looking armor. He had seen battle before. She was certain of that. She let her gaze snap to his face, a small smirk forming on her lips as she saw his skin color. He was slightly dark-skinned, and his hair was dark and wild, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the scar on his face, and his eyes that made her take pause in her assessment. She was surprised to see such a scar on his face. In this land, it would be nothing for a pony trained in healing magic to take care of a wound like that. This meant that he did indeed come from another land. On top of that, his eyes were not typical. While they appeared fierce, they had softness to them, and something else. Hidden behind that, she couldn't tell what. She would have to get closer if she really wanted to get a good look. Perhaps sneak up to him later on in the small village. Chrysalis waited silently as she watched both the creature and Luna walking away, heading back toward the village, her smile growing as she saw the blush on his face. He was timid around Luna. Perhaps he would be shy around aggressive females as a whole. A small plan began to form in the back of her mind as she rose to her hooves and began to move into the clearing, taking note of the imposing statue in front of her. She would sneak into Ponyville tonight and just watch him in order to observe his nature and learn more about him. Then, as the night would continue, she would introduce herself to him. She would play the part of a mare who would be timid at first, and then quite friendly, forcing him to join her in conversation, and hopefully reveal more of his nature to her. That would give her more time to work at getting him to fall for her, but she had to be careful. This was Ponyville. The troublesome Twilight Sparkle and her friends, who wielded the elements of harmony, lived here. If she wasn't careful, they may find her out, and that would be the end of her. She also had to make certain she didn't make herself suspicious to her target either. He was from a different world. He may be able to sense more about her than regular ponies, and she had to be careful, though the reward had the potential to easily outweigh the risk. She took a moment to check that her magic was still holding the facade she now wore before, letting her eyes widen and her facial features soften to the point that she now appeared to be a wide-eyed, innocent, lovable pony that didn't have a care in the world. With a small dark chuckle, she trotted after her prey, her tail flicking with anticipation.